Welcome everybody to the first PCNV meeting of 2022. We're rising to our 16th birthday with the establishment of PCNV and these meetings. As we begin, let us acknowledge that wherever it is that we are sitting in at the moment, we are sitting on the lands of the country of First Peoples group in your location. I am located on the country of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation, and I acknowledge their elders and ancestors with respect. As far as some of the minor details about how we'll organise this, please keep your microphone on mute. You will be able to unmute it later when you're invited to ask questions, and then you can remute after you've had your speak. And as you know, as experienced Zoom users, that it can be rather distracting if people forget to mute themselves, and we get, as Greg says, extraneous conversations and phone calls and stuff. The other thing that I would advise you to do for a better viewing experience is to select speaker view for your screen, and then you'll get the person who's speaking, which for the most part will be Greg. Greg will speak for however long it takes him to speak, perhaps 35 to 40 minutes, or thereabouts, and then we'll have an opportunity for a Q&A session and perhaps some discussion. But let me introduce Greg to you, although he doesn't need a very much introduction, I think, because back in 2006, Greg was one of, I think, our very first speaker at one of these PCNV meetings. So he's got form in terms of his presence at these meetings, and he's spoken on several other occasions as well. So welcome back, Greg.
Thank you.
Greg is going to speak to us about a book which he has edited with quite a bit of Australian, New Zealand content, but from other places as well. The book, which will be published later this year through Westar, and it's called AFTERLIVES, Jesus in Global Perspectives, and he will explain the objectives that the book has and how it's organised and what's in it that's important for you to rush out and buy the book. Greg is a noted theologian and academic. He's just retired and a minister in placement in important roles in the Anglican Church, both here and elsewhere in the world, particularly in Jerusalem. He's just retired as Dean of Grafton and was previously Dean of St. George's College in Jerusalem. As I said, he's well known to many members of the PCNV through his involvement in the Common Dreams project and with the PCNV events over the years. He's now director of the Centre of Coins, Culture and Religious History at St. John's Cathedral in Brisbane. And he's written several books, particularly Jesus Then and Jesus Now and the Once and Future Scriptures, and edited several others, including this new collection. So welcome, Greg. Over to you, and we look forward to your presentation.
Okay, thanks very much, Dick. And I've also gone to speaker view, so I can no longer see all the faces. but I did catch sight of quite a number of people that I know from years past. So that's really great. I'm just going to go straight into share view, share screen straight away and add the presentation. So this will be what we'll work with for the next few minutes. In terms of length, I'm guessing it's going to be somewhere between 35 and 40 minutes. What I've done is I've prepared the material in layers because I wasn't exactly sure how long it would go for and how long before, whether there might be a need for some extra sort of filler, as it were, to keep it going. I'm just going to see if I can get rid of all the little windows on the corner, but not at the moment. Okay. Okay. So we're talking about this book, and it's ironic to be doing a kind of a book launch of a book that isn't actually available yet. And that's a story of COVID, I think, more than anything else. COVID has not only disrupted everything else in the world, it's also disrupted the process of getting the chapters from people, which range from chapters that came in by return email to one chapter which is still out in the wild, but keep getting told it'll be finished at any day, but it hasn't yet seen the light of day. So there may be a second chapter by me going into the first section of the book if that doesn't turn up very, very quickly. So let me just talk a little bit about the book and the ideas behind the project, how the project came together, some of the things which I found most interesting as I reflect on the book at this point in the process. And then if we've got a bit of extra time before we go into discussion, we can talk a little bit about my particular contribution in chapter 1 of the book. So starting from simply the point that thinking the sort of character of Jesus, the person of Jesus very much captivated my thinking over the years. It's probably mostly an accident of history. It's to do with where I grew up, the faith community, religious community in which I was being nurtured. Had I grown up in a different family in Lismore on the north coast of New South Wales, or in a different part of the country or in another part of the world, no doubt my interests and my life story would have been totally different. But I happened to grow up in a community which took their version of Christianity very seriously, and a community which for which Jesus was kind of the lightning rod. For me growing up, Jesus was simply God. I mean, he was, to take the phrase from Bishop John Robinson, Jesus was the human face of God, but we weren't nearly that sophisticated in the Lismore Church of Christ. We simply said, if you're talking to Jesus, you're talking to God, kind of thing. So that was very much something which has shaped a lot of the way I am hardwired, in a sense, to think about Jesus. But of course, over the years, I've come to appreciate that in whatever ways it may be true that to encounter Jesus is to encounter God, and there are many twists and turns in how you would define that. Despite Dick's introduction, I'm not so much a theologian, I'm just a scripture scholar. So I just deal with what the text says and leave my theological colleagues to tell us what it means some of the time. So I grew up with this sense that, to see Jesus was to see God. But much later, of course, I came to realize that for me in particular, but for many, many other people in the Western cultural tradition, Jesus is an exemplar of what it means to be human. And in many ways, the key significance of Jesus for us is not what Jesus signifies about God, but rather what Jesus signifies about us, about being human, and about what a human life lived well might look like, regardless of its duration, regardless of how many years it accumulates. Of course, we all understand that Jesus has been understood very differently, at different times and in different cultures. And that could be said even without moving beyond the circle of Christianity. Within Christianity itself, Jesus is understood in many, many different ways, although Christians have a track record for getting out the pencils and drawing kind of thick lines and saying who are the outsiders and who are the insiders. And one of the lines they draw is what people say about Jesus. If you don't say the right things about Jesus, you're obviously outside the circle of those who are okay, of those who are blessed, of those who are saved. So even within Christianity, there's great diversity, but of course, and what this book is teasing out very much is the idea that actually the significance of Jesus in all his different afterlives is not limited to those who might, in some sense or other, claim the title Christian or the self-description of Christian. People that are well outside Christianity, either in a post-Christian space or simply have never been people of Christian faith, are often still to some degree fascinated by Jesus and find him to be of some value to them individually or collectively. One of the surprising delights of my time in Grafton, the last 4 or 5 years, has been getting to know a local, I could probably say the local Hindu priest, who's one of the contributors to this book. And as he makes very clear in his chapter, Vishal makes very clear in his chapter, as a practicing yogi and a Hindu priest, for him, Jesus is his spiritual master. And he tells me that he spends 2 or 3 hours every day speaking with Jesus. Now, I've had people on parish council that try that line on me as well, but in Vishal's case, I find it a little bit more persuasive. So people well outside Christianity. This slide is just putting up some covers of different books in which either as monographs or as chapters or whatever, I've been involved in this kind of thinking out loud in public about Jesus, which is what we get to do when we are able to have our ideas published. So let's come to the actual book itself, which as you saw back on the first slide is Afterlives and then Global Perspectives on Jesus, or Jesus in Global Perspective, whichever way those words end up in the final sequence on the front cover will be how it is. And the first thing I've had to clarify for people, of course, especially people when they first hear about this book, is no, it's not a book about the resurrection. Okay. If I wrote a book about the resurrection, that will be a very short trip to a heresy trial, most likely. So this is not a book about the resurrection of Jesus. It's not a study of where I think Jesus is now and what kind of circumstances he may be in at the present time. It's not that kind of afterlife we're talking about. Rather, so it's not where is Jesus, what happened to Jesus, in what sense might Jesus be still spoken of as somebody alive. Rather, it's asking about the sort of ripple effects of Jesus and thinking of each ripple, each person or culture or period, which in some way has been impacted by Jesus as an afterlife. And so when we start thinking about Jesus from that perspective, and when we start to invite people of very different perspectives just to write and to think out loud in public about how they think about Jesus, you get some very interesting perspectives that are quite diverse. And in a sense, the collection of essays began to organize itself, and we'll see shortly how the book is being structured. When I say book, it may actually end up being 3 books, or at least 3 volumes, but it's looking like it may be 3 books when it finally comes out. But the sort of set of essays which came together basically organized themselves around different time periods, but also different sets of questions and different cultural dynamics in the world today. So the book itself, I guess for a while I've been thinking about what might the next book be about. And I was conscious that the next book was always going to be about Jesus beyond Christianity. And I'd started hinting at this, making some fairly sort of preliminary observations about that in the final chapters of some of my earlier work. And just making the point, for example, that the church no longer has a monopoly on the Jesus brand, that Jesus has a future and has a dimension of influence well beyond the churches. So I knew that was kind of what I was probably going to be writing about. And then the idea came, well, rather than me try to get across all these different aspects, what if I invited colleagues and friends that I knew of, and if they invited people that they knew, and we just basically saw who came along and offered a contribution to the project. So the idea was that in one sense, the book is grounded in what we know, what we think we know about the historical Jesus 2,000 years ago, but that's not what this book is about. So I write about that in the first chapter, surprise, surprise. But very, very quickly, the other contributions to the book just leave that well behind. And in no sense is the concern for the historical Jesus much of an influence on most of the other essays. Having said that, there, even in the final section of the book, there are people that are referencing their contemporary cultural view of Jesus, are referencing that in what they understand Jesus to have been like in his own life and practice. So there is a kind of a connection there. But again, it's not a book about the historical Jesus. It's a book about the impact of Jesus in different places and times. And of course, we're all aware as we do a project like that of some of the Christological interpretations of Jesus. And indeed, a couple of the chapters in the first part of the book deal with how the Christological afterlives took shape. We'll talk about that probably a bit more next month. But the other thing I wanted this collection to be was to be a collection of work which was sensitive to and listened to readings of Jesus, understandings of Jesus in other religions. And when push came to shove, that meant I had to be generous enough as an editor to accept a chapter from a person who's a Mormon, for example, whose view of Jesus is not one for which I would have a lot of empathy or sympathy, but it was part of the discipline of the book to listen to different people from different times and different perspectives talking about what Jesus meant to them or how Jesus has an afterlife in their particular faith community, or indeed totally outside any faith community. And of course, it's not just that religious people have a perspective on Jesus. It's becoming increasingly obvious that Jesus is a significant cultural figure, irrespective of anyone's religion. Okay. And I know friends of mine have got into trouble by saying, well, Jesus is up there with major figures like Buddha or Muhammad or Mahatma Gandhi. But in a cultural sense, that's right. It will alarm some of our more conservative friends, but for people for whom sort of quibbling over theology is like the medieval arguments about the number of angels that could sit on a pinhead, for people who are not into our internal Jesus talk, then the most important thing about Jesus is not what he means to Christians, but what Jesus means to people who have no particular faith perspective, but they still find this figure somebody who they are inclined to respect and who they sometimes want to know more about, not because they're looking for a fire insurance, but they're intrigued by this person because of his afterlives, his influence in our culture. So I sent an invitation out to a few people, and I put the invitation on my website as well. And it simply said you were looking to do this set of essays, which will explore the impact of Jesus within and beyond Christianity, including his many afterlives in literature, the arts, social justice, and world religion during the past 2,000 years, and especially in our present global context. And I made it clear in that invitation that the term afterlife is being used in the way that Yvonne Sherwood do in her really delightful book on Jonah, which had the subtitle, A Biblical Text and Its Afterlives, The Survival of Jonah in Western Culture. And that's a book I'd highly recommend. It's a delightful exercise in showing how a piece of biblical tradition, which actually most likely has zero historical basis, nonetheless has this incredible afterlife for hundreds and indeed thousands of years afterwards. So that's what the big idea at the heart of this book was about. That's just the front cover from the book. A biblical text and its afterlives, the survival of Jonah in Western culture. It might be a little bit hard to make out what's going on there, but this is the image on the front cover is actually a modern Jewish person returning to the land of Israel after the Holocaust and the end of World War II. He's landing at the port in Haifa, and he's walking down the plank from the whale's mouth, carrying 2 suitcases and dressed as you would expect a Jewish refugee from Europe to be dressed in the 1940s. And this image is part of the afterlife of Jonah. Okay, so that was kind of the inspiration for the model for this book. And it was made very clear to the participants, this is not an exercise in Christian apologetics. It's not even an interfaith project, except in the sense that many of the contributors are from a Christian context of some kind, while others are from other religious backgrounds. There are Jewish and Muslim people, Hindu, and some are simply people from other religious or cultural contexts, may not claim any particular religious affiliation at all. And as we're familiar with most of the books that most of us are reading in progressive theological circles, their original work grounded in critical thinking, critical scholarship, and reflective practice, but the idea was to make sure it was expressed in non-technical language so that the material was going to be accessible to people who weren't specialists in the field. And I have to admit that the one chapter that sent me to the dictionary multiple times was written by a contributor from Singapore whose English was of such a high order. It's actually very challenging to read, but there are some battles you don't fight, even as the editor of a book. So this is just to give a quick overview of kind of how the book has taken shape. There's a set of about 11 or so chapters that in some way or other address historical afterlives of Jesus. And it's hopefully an interesting set of essays in its own right. And indeed, the way that Westar is looking at it, it will appear as a volume by itself, and the second set will be a second volume, and so on. So we might have book launches all year. So I've done a chapter just to kind of introduce the thing, but also talk about the pastness and the futureness of Jesus. We've got a chapter from John Dominic Crossan looking at Jesus and parables. Now that's, for most of us, that's kind of ground zero in historical Jesus research. Got a lovely piece by David Cohen from Perth, Discovering Jesus in the Psalms, looking at early Christian reception of the Psalms, which if you think about it, are Jewish songs for use in the temple, now being adopted by Christians, by Jesus groups in the second, third centuries. And in that act of reception, we're seeing a process of reinterpreting the Psalms as actually the voice of Jesus, and it's talking about Jesus. So that's one of another angle on the afterlives. James Tabor, a well-known American scholar, has done a thing on Jesus as an apocalyptic prophet of the New Age. And a little bit surprising in where he goes with it, and probably not going where you might normally think a title like that would take us. The Apocryphal Jesus is a chapter looking at what the stories about it's apocryphal stories about Jesus, which didn't make it into the New Testament, but what does the creation and the preservation of those stories tell us in terms of the afterlives of Jesus? Jeffrey Dunn has done a piece on how Tertullian represents, in his thinking about Jesus, a different, rather more formalized theological afterlife for Jesus. David Golston, who some of you will know as the director of Westar, he's done a not unrelated piece in a way, putting how Jesus had an afterlife in terms of ancient Greek philosophy. And this is particularly focused in this essay around the idea of the logos. So what happens when Jesus is being understood through that kind of a lens? Colleague of mine from the Coin Centre at the Cathedral, to give a shorthand name, colleague of mine from there has written a piece on Jesus Christ in Byzantine coins. Again, this is where Jesus starts to appear on the coins of the realm, and there's a whole other afterlife being created with imperial powers to boot. Another friend of mine from that centre, actually, now based in South Australia, Josh Kellum, has done a study on the Aryan Jesus, looking how Jesus was claimed perversely by the Nazis, which of course is more than ironic given that he was Jewish, but of course they wanted to say that he wasn't Jewish, he was an Aryan. But there's a whole chapter of our recent history where Jesus is being re-engineered to suit a particular nationalistic and political perspective. Wouldn't surprise me if the current occupant at the Kremlin would be interested in putting out the Russian Jesus and showing a similar kind of perversion. Michael Free, who's a friend and colleague of mine from Brisbane, and also a clinical psychologist, he's written a book, he's written a book as well, but he's written this chapter on Jesus and the idea of the individual, me as a Western individual, and how that is shaped by one of the afterlives of Jesus. And Peter Klein, who's took over my former position as academic dean, St. Francis College in Brisbane, has written a book, really a chapter, teasing out the afterlives of Jesus in the way we incarnate our values and ourselves in daily life. So I think quite a challenging array of voices there. The second section is looking more at interfaith afterlives. It starts out with a chapter by Robert Price on contextuality as incarnation. And in Robert's usual style, he's one of the long-serving members of the Jesus Seminar, the Westar Institute. He's really thrown down some provocative ideas about, so where are the limits? If we want to if we want to see the faith indigenized, we want to see it enculturated, then what range of variation do we accept as valid? And then we went into not an entirely predictable set of essays, and there were a number of others I was hoping to have in this section, but we just couldn't round them up in time with COVID and everything else. So we have a chapter on Jesus in the Quran by Mustafa Abu Sway, who's one of the leading Islamic scholars in Jerusalem and one of the trustees of the Dome of the Rock. Richard Freund, a Jewish scholar, from the US has written an essay on writing the afterlives, comparing the afterlife of Jesus with the afterlife of a particularly significant Jewish rabbi or teacher known as the Vilna Gaon. Lorraine, who's with us this afternoon, has written has offered a chapter on the disappeared Jesus. She'll probably say more about this next month, and how this is playing out through the emancipation of European Jewry back basically in the 18th and 19th century. So you can see the sort of Jewish faith intersections, the Muslim interfaith intersections. Another chapter from the sort of Jewish side of the conversation is by my friend Richard Sherwin outside Tel Aviv, who is an Israeli Jewish poet who writes poems about Jesus to explore his Jewish identity, his own Jewish identity. And a number of his poems feature in that essay. And there's the piece by Vishal Sharma, who's the person I mentioned before, the local Hindu priest in Grafton. Have a really interesting piece, and they all are, but from totally outside my realm of expertise, on Confucian receptions of Jesus in late imperial China. And it's to the extent that you have cultural blinkers at all like mine, we not only know very little about what's going on in the Middle East and the Arabic speaking world, but we tend in the West to know very little about the cultural history of China. And there's a whole depth story there beyond what we see in the newspapers, of course. Keith Thompson is, I think, from Sydney, at the Catholic University in Sydney, and he's contributed a chapter on the Christology of Joseph Smith, which is what the chapter I referred to earlier is pushing some of my boundaries in terms of, well, how big is this circle in terms of interfaith conversation. David Merritt, who many of you would know, contributed a chapter thinking about, from a Christian educator's perspective, how do we engage with Jesus in secular Australia? Rex Hunt, who one or two of you will have heard of, has written a piece on Jesus in the Australian landscape. Okay. And the value of a wild faith that actually is in some sense centered on or inspired by nature. And John Smith, who I'm sure you will all know, at least those of you from Victoria, has written a lovely chapter on Jesus and the transforming influence of friendship. And I know he's also written a much longer short book on that topic as well. So these are all kind of interfaith dimensions of the afterlives of Jesus. And the third section is cultural afterlives. So we have a piece by Glenn Loughrey looking at Jesus through Indigenous Australian eyes. Not exactly matched, but as it turns out, there's another piece also from an Indigenous perspective, taking a totally different angle on all the questions to do with Indigenous identity and Jesus, contributed by Anne Patel-Gray. So if we got those two people on a panel, that might be fun. Peter Catt at Brisbane Cathedral has done a piece reflecting on the social justice Jesus in the context of King's Cross and homelessness. Jenny Tapar-Daniel from Aotearoa, New Zealand, has written a more reflective piece about her own journey as an Indigenous Maori Anglican woman who was told to be nice like Jesus and not to be, that she grew up with this conflict between the God who was a tribal chief, fitted well with her culture, and her discovery that actually Jesus wasn't always meek and mild, and that he could be quite hot under the collar at times, like her perhaps. Sephi Carroll has done a piece on Jesus through Pacific eyes, looking at the wider sort of Pacific afterlives of Jesus. Joseph Goh from Singapore has written a piece on Asian faces of Jesus. Rod Pattenden, who will be one of our guest next month, has written a piece on the post-colonial Jesus, particularly working with the art of Emmanuel Garibay from the Philippines, and Rod for sure will want to say something about that next week. Jonathan Sargent, who's a colleague of mine, or former colleague, I guess, of mine from St. Francis College in Brisbane, has done a piece on Jesus in comedic film. And this is really pushing into the sort of the cultural afterlives of Jesus. Hugo Cordova Cuero has offered a piece with the interesting title, Sexing Jesus, and then controversies around Christological erotic corporealities in Latin America. Really, he's exploring the afterlife of Jesus within a sort of gay and trans community in a highly conservative Roman Catholic cultural environment. So an interesting piece of work. Marion Free from Brisbane, St. Francis, has written, her chapter is on Jesus through women's eyes and looking at Jesus through a feminist perspective. And Janice McRandall, United Church minister and also involved with St. Francis College in Brisbane, she's written a no thank you kind of version of the same kind of topic, pointing out that feminists have to say no to Jesus sometimes because he's too much the boy, too much the man. So it's a fairly diverse collection of essays. Just briefly, in terms of what emerges from that, even at that macro level, as I look at it from the editor's desk, firstly, there's a diversity of contributors. And indeed, we had several others who would have liked to have been involved. One of them, sadly, Michael Kelly from Melbourne, actually died early last year and was unable to, obviously, to complete his work, but really wanted to put a piece in this collection. What happened was colleagues mentioned the project to their friends and colleagues, and it just sort of grew. So what would have perhaps been intended as a set of a dozen or 15 essays has become 32 or 33 or 34 or something. So the number of people who welcomed the opportunity to think out loud about Jesus within their own particular context, within their own area of scholarship, their own area of practice, I found really interesting in and of itself. For myself, I've expanded my own circle of people with an interest in this stuff. I mean, half the people probably contributing, maybe about a third of the people I had never come across before. So it's been really interesting to find people who are involved in this conversation, but are not part of the Westar Polbridge Jesus Seminar kind of stable. And it's been really good to be able to have essays from religious practitioners who are in no sense and would never describe themselves as academics, to be able to get their work to be ready for publishing alongside John Dominic Crossan and James Tabor and other very well-known academic names. That's been an interesting aspect of the project in and of itself. I just saw that typo, even though I've checked this so many times. There you go. So the ever-changing Jesus, unlike Hebrews 13, which famously said, Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and forever. What this project has shown, and this is not unique to this project, is that actually Jesus is not the same yesterday, today, and forever. There are so many different afterlives for the historical character. And I would be saying that every interpretation of Jesus after he took his last breath is an afterlife. Okay, so you've got Jesus, who probably remains beyond our reach, and then you've got all these afterlives, where, as we've said earlier, he means so many different things to different people, such that in terms of the spirituality marketplace and the people looking to develop their own set of values and how they're going to live their lives, the churches no longer have a monopoly on the Jesus brand. So just trying to wrap this up so we don't go more than a minute or so longer. So there's immense diversity in the way that Jesus has been understood. That's one of the big themes, I think, which comes through this collection. To really understand an idea and to really understand Jesus in this particular instance, we need to pay attention not just to what happened or what was said back then, but how that legacy, how that afterlife has been received, what's been retained, what's been jettisoned along the way, how have things been reshaped, what new meanings have been attached to the idea or to the person, what new roles have been attached to the person. And this is particularly true, of course, when you're talking about Jesus rather than just simply an idea. I guess the point I'd be making is that the New Testament Gospels and the creeds are not the end of the journey of talking about Jesus. They're just the first couple of steps in that journey. Yes, the Gospels and the creeds are part of the early reception history process, and they offer some of the earliest in the case of the Gospels and some of the most formative in the case of the creeds afterlives. But they don't exclude the generation of further afterlives as people in other contexts, totally different cultural situations and so on, reflect on the significance of Jesus for them. And I think that's what this book has really invited people into. So I think what I'm going to, I will just say one, I'll go to the next slide because I think it makes an important point. Not every afterlife of Jesus is positive. Okay. And there have been many, I would say many toxic and unhealthy afterlives given to Jesus. To the extent, as I think Diana Butler-Bass said in the last few days, what's happening in Ukraine at the moment is yet another manifestation of the desire in some cultural Christian circles to reinvigorate the Holy Roman Empire. And of course, in the Holy Roman Empire, Jesus has a key role to play. He probably has very little influence, but he'll be invoked as the inspiration and the ultimate authority figure for the Holy Roman Empire. So as it comes back yet again. So we need to have eyes wide open and not simply accept, oh, isn't that sweet? Every proposal is of equal value. No, we have to be able to discriminate and judge. And so some people do that by wanting to take everything back to the historical Jesus, which is problematic in all sorts of ways, but that's not the topic. Others will want to say, well, it's got to agree with the teachings of the church. I think that's also problematic in all sorts of ways. So my criteria, for what it's worth, for determining whether an afterlife is toxic or healthy or life-giving is a little bit eclectic. I'm more concerned with outcomes for participants than whether they're historically valid or doctrinally pure. And I'm looking for, basically, I regard as toxic deviance, any afterlives of Jesus which exploit vulnerable people, entrench injustice, threaten the long-term well-being of the natural order, no matter how good their historical or religious pedigree might be. And so, in a sense, and I've always disclosed this when talking about historical Jesus research, my personal goal in engaging in historical Jesus is ultimately not to capture the most accurate information about Jesus in the first century, much as I'd like to have that, but it is because of my original upbringing and shaping. It's to inform as accurately as I can the way that I choose to live now. Okay. And the final little dot point there is that, and I say this at one point in the introduction or in the first chapter, perhaps every intentional Christian is crafting yet another afterlife of the Galilean sage. And I think we'll stop there without all the extra stuff I did in case I didn't have enough material. But that can be, we can look at that some other time. So let's stop there and go back into general discussion. People may have particular points they'd like to raise. I've just got to find my cursor and get it. The joy of having two screens.
Very good. Craig, you've been very generous with your time and with the preparation that you put into your presentation to us this afternoon. Thank you very much. And everybody, I ask if you'd show your appreciation by putting up your little yellow hand or a wave or whatever you would like to do. Yeah, we're getting multiple hands, so I think you can take that as a great indication of the impact you've had on the audience this afternoon. We appreciate what you've done for us very much. Before we leave, Greg will be back next month, March the 27th, another Zoom meeting, which will feature a panel of 3 of the contributors to the book. Lorraine Parkinson, who's with us today, Rod Pattenden, who's a very interesting individual that perhaps not so many of you would know, but he's just retired as minister of Adamstown Uniting Church in Newcastle. He's a wonderful painter, which is by the by, and of course David Cohen, whom Greg mentioned earlier in these talks this afternoon, who's one of the contributors to the book, and I think lives in Perth. Greg basically will introduce these people and be their interrogator. And again, there will be opportunities to follow for Q&A and discussions such as we've had this afternoon. So we look forward to seeing you next month, 27th of March.
Same time.
Yes, it will be the same time, yeah, 4 o'clock. Very good. Thank you very much, everybody. And we look forward to seeing you very shortly.